I'm from the Himalayas, and my home state of Uttarakhand was an integral part of the ancient trade routes from the roof of the world. The unique spiritual culture of the Trans-Himalayan region carries the deep imprint everywhere of Tibetan thought and practice. This key session, Writing Tibet, Remembering Tibet, with Dominique, Townsend, Tsering Wangmo Dhompa, and Tenzin Dickie in conversation, is an important assertion against amnesia and against forgetting. The living memory of Tibetan culture and spiritual practices remains strong and resilient. A session that looks at the sacred heritage that the Tibetan diaspora carries within them. Although I could not make it to America for this session, I'm there with all of you in spirit as ever. Thank you and namaste.
Hi. It's really great to be here and to see you guys here. Thank you so much to Namita Gokhale, to the Jaipur Literature Festival, and to Asia Society for having us here. And I'm especially delighted to be here with my friends, Tsering Wangmo Dhompa and Dominique Townsend, both of whom are important producers of knowledge about Tibet, which, I'm excited that you guys get to listen to them speak. So I know that the title of our event, Writing Tibet, Remembering Tibet, sounds a little bit like a mournful elegy, right? And I'm sure some of you probably thought of that. But at the same time, actually, I really like the suggestion that to write Tibet is to remember Tibet. To write Tibet is to bring Tibet alive, to make it vibrant, to keep it active. And of course, there are all these different questions of who is writing Tibet, who is remembering Tibet, and like, what does that mean? It's now been 70 years since the Chinese military takeover of Tibet. It's 70 years of a colonial occupation. It's 60 years of Tibetan exile. And during that period of time, we've seen some generational changes. We've seen the discourse on Tibet change. We've seen the writing change. We've seen the conversation change. And we've seen that change multiple times, I think. So I just want to start off by asking you to talk a little bit about the politics of the literature on Tibet. I just thought, we're here at Asia Society. That seems like a fruitful way to start.
That's such a wide topic, but I'll start by saying...
You can take it any way you like.
When I was getting out of Penn Station this afternoon, there was, I guess, a small scribbling on the wall, sort of the makeshift construction wall, and it said, "Can we still find love this summer?" And I thought, well, that's a question I think that Tibetans in exile have been asking every year, right? Like on Tibetan New Year, we say, see you in Tibet next year? That question. So I think if we talk about Tibetan literature, maybe since 1959, perhaps within Tibet and outside of Tibet, I'm sure some of the concerns are similar in the sense that the preoccupation with history, with language, and with conditions of life, right? And for Tibetans inside Tibet, that might mean conditions of life under Chinese rule and in exile. conditions of life in a sort of a state of perpetual dispossession. And so I think the concerns are similar, but they're probably broached in slightly different ways. And actually, Dickie, you said in an interview that Tibetans in Tibet, when they write, they write to conceal, and that Tibetans in exile, that they perform, right? And I think that's such a great way of, I think, pointing to the conditions of life, right? In Tibet, writing comes at huge risk, and so when writers are writing, they write in various ways, that they're using craft in a number of different ways, right? Form as well as ambiguity and devices, poetic devices. And in exile, I think the question of homecoming really becomes very crucial, and so there's an idea and relationship with Tibet, a sense of precarity. I think that's of a different nature. So I think just to sort of give a broad kind of approach, I think those would be some of the impulses, I think, of literature.
Thank you. So I really write as a scholar of Tibet and as a historian and as someone who has a long interest in Tibetan literature, especially Tibetan Buddhist literature. But actually, the way that Buddhism interacts with Tibetan literature more broadly is I actually think more, well, let's say before 1959, Buddhism was more kind of pervasive in its shaping of the literature that was kind of broadly produced and available, and that was largely because textual production happened primarily, not exclusively, but primarily in Buddhist monasteries. And one change, I mean, that still is the case to a certain extent, but I'm very interested in the ways that Buddhism is sort of kind of put into perspective in the broader range of Tibetan literature that's being produced, say today, right? It's still a very important part of many Tibetans' identity and of many aspects of Tibetan literary production. But I would say it seems to me, as an observer, that it is sort of in a more balanced perspective, and we see all these other aspects of Tibetan memory, of Tibetan identity, of Tibetan futures in all over the world that are in conversation with Buddhism and in dialogue with Buddhism, but there's no longer this sense of Buddhism's kind of dominance in the production of Tibetan literature. Mm-hmm. And even as somebody who loves Buddhism very much, and that's the sort of heart of my own scholarship and translation practice, that's something that's really exciting to me to witness and observe, and especially I'm very curious about the futures, and I think probably multiple futures of Tibetan literature. As it's being produced today, for the edited volume that Dickie just is coming out with, right?
It just came out.
It just came out, right?
Yep.
The Penguin essay collection of modern Tibetan essays is so exciting in its diversity. Its diversity regionally, it's in terms of who's represented. Its diversity in terms of sort of relationships to Buddhism, but to also other aspects of Tibetan history and identity. So I guess I want to bring that in, Buddhism in as a part of Tibetan history, as a part of Tibetan literature and cultural production, but one that seems to me is coming into a new balance currently. Again, still very important, but no longer in the same kind of dominant position as it had been, right, in previous times. So I find that to be quite a fascinating dynamic.
So I want to follow up on that, actually. By asking, okay, so Buddhism, of course, right, historically when you think about Tibetan literature, like you think about Tibetan Buddhist literature, and Buddhism has had this huge impact on Tibetan psychology, Tibetan culture, Tibetan basically everything, right? And of course, it's not just for Tibet. For a lot of cultures worldwide, religion has had a major impact on the culture and on the literature. So my question about Buddhism is, in terms of, like, what is the impact or influence of Buddhism on modern Tibetan literature, on secular Tibetan literature? So, I mean, and I'm asking both of you, you as you know, a scholar, and Tsering, for you as a writer of modern Tibetan literature, like what is the impact of Buddhism that you see, right?
Well, I mean, as a scholar and a writer, really, Tsering, I'm curious to hear what you think the kind of role of Buddhism is in contemporary Tibetan literature. I have my ideas, but I'd love to hear yours first.
I'm put in the spot. I think, you know, I've been thinking about that question, partly reading some of the new works, where I think Buddhism, because we grew up within a particular ethos, also the language, right? So I think that so much of the language of everyday Buddhism has shaped our, I guess, ways of talking about exile, right? The idea that exile is a bardo, right? That this state of, that in-betweenness, right? The state after death and before the next life. And that's a trope that comes up very often. And also the function of like renunciation, right? Renunciation not just as kind of a organizing principle of plot, so renunciation as a theme, but also renunciation as almost like sort of a solution, right? So novels like, I think, House of Tesur, which was maybe published in 1993 in Tibet, in English, and I think he wrote in Tibetan as well as in English. The protagonist in the end chooses to become a monk, or, you know, goes into seclusion. In Falling Through the Roof, a novel by Thupten Samphel, in that novel too, the main protagonist is initially a sort of part of the underground Tibetan Communist Party in New Delhi, and he's an activist, and then he also becomes a lama, right? And so I'm so curious about sort of this idea of renunciation as being a kind of turn, right? In also Tsering Namgyal's A Tibetan Suitcase, the main protagonist again lives in the US and then goes back to India, and he sort of doesn't know what home is anymore, right? Like, India is not quite home, but it's home-like, right? And home-like is the closest that he can get to, because he can't go back to Tibet. And in that too, it seems like renunciation becomes a way, right, to sort of, I guess, come to some kind of answer to his life. In Tsering Lama's newest novel, which is a wonderful novel that I hope you all get to read.
We measure the earth with our bodies.
Yeah, we measure the earth with our bodies. Again, you know, the title itself is symbolic of a practice as Buddhists, when they go on pilgrimages, you know, sort of they make full body prostrations. And in the novel, the final sort of ending is really, again, returning to the idea of homecoming, but the homecoming is deferred, right? Because it sort of seems like it cannot happen in this lifetime, and it's deferred to future lifetimes, right? So all of the Buddhist tropes and Buddhist ideas, I think, are also shaping the way in which we're telling stories, which I think is quite interesting.
Yes, yeah, and I think also all the examples you give, there's a way in which Buddhism is not, in a lot of ways, like a kind of idealized, you know, kind of other life that one can step into, right? Buddhism just exists in all the decisions that one makes, right, as a writer or as a thinker, as a person with a body, and those ways that, you know, I think sometimes maybe in the early history of the kind of European an American encounter with Buddhism, which of course came through colonialism, there was this kind of sense that Buddhism was this kind of pure ideal form of renunciation that also could map nicely onto a kind of secular, a modernism or something. And actually, I think as Buddhist studies, kind of matures and develops, we can see the ways that Buddhism is really lived, right? And it's never a kind of, pure, there's no kind of pure accomplishment, right, of renunciation. Renunciation is always in tension with other commitments, even with other, if you think about the life story of the Buddha. I teach Buddhist studies to undergraduates, at Bard College, and they were just reading the life story of Buddha, and they always stop at the realization that Buddha had a wife and child before he chose to follow this ascetic path, and so this idea of his pure renunciation is always balanced by these you could say entanglements, but also these other aspects of life, right? And so I guess I think that in a context where textual production is happening primarily in monasteries, I think there's always been a lot of nuance to Tibetan Buddhist literature, but I'm very excited by these kind of contemporary expressions where, like you said, with we measure the earth with our body. Buddhism is just in there with the rest of life, with the rest of trouble and the rest of relationships and heartbreaks, and it's part of the texture of life rather than being some kind of ideal form. And I think I love seeing that development in Tibetan literature.
Can I jump in?
Of course.
The other thing that, when you were talking about how it's sort of being brought in, I think that there is a slight difference in we measure the earth with our bodies in the sense that the political is kept very much alive. Whereas I think sometimes Buddhism becomes a way, I think, to move away from politics and sort of go into the realm of morality, right? Or sort of, there's the other forces that determine one's life. And I think that ideas of justice, ideas of sort of, the everyday struggles of people sometimes gets eclipsed, So I like that Tsering Lama brings into the novel this question of politics, but also that dispossession, while it's physical, it's territorial, it's also spiritual, it's existential, it's psychological. She brings in all of that, so there's room for struggle, there's room for questions of justice, as well as like questions of also taking the spiritual path, right? I think she asks that question. One of the characters, Dhoma, asks why, something to the, I'm not quoting it correctly, but like, why are people so interested in our culture but not our suffering? And I think that's such a profound question, which sometimes I think, for Tibetans, there is that feeling that the world has forgotten us, and, sort of Buddhism is so appealing, and everybody, thinks we're all such peaceful, like we're levitating, we're kind, and, but they forget, right, that we're still living as people who are dispossessed, right, and that our country is still colonized. And I think that sort of that ongoingness is lost when sort of you talk about the long cycle, right, of Buddhism.
May I also say too that I love when you say politics, you don't just mean the politics of sort of statehood or military occupation, right? But in that novel, for instance, politics is also about knowledge production, right? It's about who are the scholars who get to tell the stories of what is Tibet and what's the significance of Tibet, who owns artworks, right? What are the politics of the art world, and what's valued and what's not? How are these things valued? So yeah, for me, Buddhism is really, I guess in some sense I would admit, only interesting when it's kind of embedded in the world of all these other kinds of questions and problems. And I agree. I think her novel is a great example, but I think I'm seeing that more and more in Tibetan literature in terms of that kind of futures of Tibetan literature. I'm excited to see where that develops.
So, okay, I asked both of you guys to prepare a little like a really quick reading, right? Like speaking of the texture and the texts of our lives. I thought it would be nice for the audience to hear directly from your work a little bit, and then maybe you can talk about it.
Sure. Okay,
For
sure.
both of you.
You put me on the spot now. Okay, pardon me for reading from my phone. Okay, actually, Tsering mentioned the bardo, and this sort of analogy of exile, life in exile to the bardo, this sort of in-betweenness. And so this is a translation. Actually, I should say it's a collaborative translation that I've been working on with Laurie Anderson, the multimedia artist, and Ben Bogan, who's another scholar of Tibetan Buddhism, and with their permission, I'm sharing it with you. So this is a set of verses from the 15th century on sort of facing those in-between states, right? And so Tsering mentioned one of the in-between states, which is the state between death and rebirth, but actually there are other in-between states, like dream and meditation, and birth, and in the end, it turns out that every state is an in-between state by this method, right? So here are the verses. Listen, now when you see that death can come at any time, don't be lazy. There's no time to lose. Learn, reflect, and meditate. You will see that everything is the Buddha. Now you are a human being. Don't get lost. Now when you see that life itself is a dream, don't doze off. Don't sleep like the dead do. Clear your mind. When you dream, experiment with shifting forms. Don't sleep like the animals do. Use sleep to wake up. Now when you see what it means to meditate, don't be confused. Free your mind and settle down. As you imagine forms arising and dissolving, steady yourself. Leave old habits behind. Don't be overwhelmed by delusions or emotions. Listen, now when you see that you are dying, focus on these instructions. Let go of desire and attachment. As you separate from your body, recognize your skin and bones as a fleeting illusion. Move your mind into timeless, boundless space. Now when you see the bardo of reality, don't panic. Recognize everything as your own mind. This is how the bardo appears. Now at the moment of death, peaceful and violent energies arise. Don't be afraid. Now when you face unending rebirth, focus your mind. Resist the pull into another lifetime. Cut your attachment to the cycle of death and life. Take courage. See your teachers as the Buddha. When death seems distant to you, it's easy to get lost in everyday concerns, and so life comes to nothing. The meaning of Dharma is to recognize what's essential, so practice the Dharma right now. The great lamas said, hold your teacher's instructions in your mind. Otherwise, you're just fooling yourself. So that's a translation that I wanted to share with you on the sort of broader concept of the bardo states. Thank you. Thanks.
Why did you choose to read this, Dominique?
Well, this is as I said, I work as a historian, and for me, this sort of, the kind of impact of these verses brings with them quite a lot of complexity, and even though there is a way in which the claim here is like, you better wake up, right? And that the Dharma should be the center, but there are these other statements like that everything you experience is the Buddha, right? That every all these sort of different phenomenal aspects of life, experiences of life, are part of the experience of what it means to recognize the bardo, recognize the in-between state. And so from my perspective, it gives this sort of sense of you can't actually isolate this into one moment or one place, you know. If the dream and meditation and death and birth and living and reality are all bardos, you know, it's hard to find anything that's not in between. And so for me, I find that quite interesting to extend the analogy to exile, right? Thank you. So again, it's a collaborative translation and a work in progress.
I'll read from a new collection of poems that I'm working on. It's called Substitute Heart. And the first section is really looking at canonical Buddhist texts and sort of playing off some of the ways in which ideas of everyday life in Buddhism are taught to young children. And the second section is looking at representations of Tibet written by the scribes who came with Colonel Younghusband during the 1904 expedition to Tibet. And I find, you know, the language really beautiful of those English writers, but you'll see what's problematic, right? The scribe notes that the Tibetan housewife throws a stone better than her European counterpart, despite her grimy face, despite the baby in her arms, despite the turquoise crown, despite looking like winter stone. Perhaps he was thinking of a particular woman at home, recalled against a friendlier sky. It was not the usual kind of fighting, the straight lines of a barren landscape, the excessive friendliness of the dust, and sometimes the people are viewed in words. The scribe in the army shows how empires write stories. Stripes on hillside prove respite from the monotony of sameness, the umber of clefts, rude red willows. Here and there, sullen maroon swaddling men in ropes. Here and there, crumbling houses. Here and there, thistles straddling rocks. The heaving lungs. References to hills, references to maps, references to birds and rocks. Hardship. All necessary. All records necessary, for it is from behind boulders that hiding Tibetans spring like they are just entering their own story. A day's work is recorded in counting the dead and the wounded. A lark, a spider, tizzy in the frost. So I think what really interested me in these accounts are the very particular details of, you know, of landscape, right? And so you have meticulous accounting of the number of birds and the sightings of flowers, and then the people are just sort of dismissed as like dirty, you know, sort of dusty, of really no consequence, right? Like sort of still on their way to being improved. And so I've been writing poems, sort of reading those old accounts.
I'm glad you chose to read that. I guess this is probably my final question, and then I think we can move into questions from the crowd if you guys have any questions. Can you talk a little bit about, both of you, about the impact of politics on literature? And you can also turn it around and, you know, talk about the impact of literature on politics. And I guess, like, we're talking, you know, I'm thinking in a Tibetan context.
Mm. Well, I think that you already, you know, quoted Dickie, sort of, or paraphrased Dickie, about the ways that the kind of political, I guess, climates of Tibetans living in exile, right? Because they're so diverse, the places that Tibetans live in exile. lead to a certain kind of performance, as you said, or a certain kind of, exhibiting, right? Sort of showing and making clear the kind of conflict, the relationship to the military occupation, to this longstanding kind of political dominance, and that as an observer, and I could put this back as a question, but as an observer, it does sometimes appear to be a kind of weight to be worked out from under. You said Tibetans are jumping from behind the boulder. This sort of sense of, yes, that is the reality, or those are the realities, and yet, what a weight to carry, to sort of have to have that be the dominant story, right, for so many diverse people and so many diverse places. So I guess that's why I was emphasizing in the initial comments, like my excitement about the diversity of relationships to things like Buddhism, which has been another kind of dominant force in Tibetan literary production. And then I think in exile, there's just unthinkable constraints of the political situation and the real danger, the imminent danger that people live in and work with. I've been really amazed by the kind of vibrancy of literary and intellectual communities on social media, for instance, right, on WeChat. The amount that people manage to say to each other and to sort of convey, and literature that they're sharing, despite the very sharp risk that people are taking, is quite inspiring and astounding. But again, there's this sort of sense of the political dominating. That doesn't mean that it's monochrome in how it gets played out, but I guess I would, I hope for, a lifting of that, right? If not the pure homecoming of the ideal, just the kind of lifting of that the dominance of the political narrative. And there are many ways in which so many Tibetan thinkers and writers, just do really operate out of that, their way out of it all the time. But it does really seem to, it seems to me as an observer to be quite a heavy blanket, one way or the other.
Yeah. I was thinking actually on the train when I was coming from Philadelphia a few hours ago, how, for 64 years we've been, when I say we, I mean, I'm sort of talking about Tibetans of my generation. To some extent, I feel like we've been sort of carrying a love for something in absence, right? And it's hard after a long time what to make of that love, right? And I think for our parents, it was sort of a direct relationship, right? They were born in Tibet, they were from Tibet, and I think for us, it is real, but it's also an idea of Tibet,
our long-distance
right?
boyfriend.
Yeah. So, there is something, I think, to carrying that kind of love, right? And I think that's why I think homecoming does become, in some ways, it's always there, right? And I think also the ongoingness. It's not like you're always thinking about it, but then the reality, right, for many of us, I'll talk about myself, all my family members are in Tibet. So, at least once a week I think about it, right? That I've lived separated from family members and that I can't see them. And so I think, these are not things we're carrying with us and sighing, and but they shape how we view the world. They shape our ideas of belonging. They shape, where we end up going. So I think, what we end up reading, it does infiltrate into the decisions we make on a day-to-day basis, right? And so I think that it also enters into our writing in so many different ways. It's hard to escape it. And to some extent, like the idea of freedom would be like writing like a fantasy novel for us, right, at this point. And so I think, it's sort of, like the question freedom occurs constantly in writings from Tibet, but also writings in exile. So I think it's hard to dislodge that, right, when it's sort of, it's something that we're still working towards. Yeah. I forgot your question.
I think you answered it.
May I add one other thing on the way that literature might affect politics? Because I think I was thinking about how politics, maybe constrains or determines not everything about literature, but certain kinds of directions. But I think that, especially if we think about politics as power and as relationships between kind of different sources of power, and don't just think about the nation state, or then literature has so much potential to influence politics, right? To ask people to think in new ways about their relationships to others, to people that they have authority over, to people who have authority over them, whether financially or in terms of knowledge or in terms of age or whatever. So I think literature is an incredibly powerful tool or set of possibilities in terms of shaping and influencing politics, especially if we don't just get limited into thinking about the kind of nuts and bolts of the nation state.
Yeah. Absolutely, I think it's one way that we can create a place, right? Like, if we can't create it we can't create sort of Tibet. I mean, although in exile we keep trying to, right? But in writing, we can have control over our narrative in a way that we don't over our lives, right? So I think that's also really the power of literature.
Yeah, I do think both. I mean, inside Tibet, with all of its repressions, right? I mean, people continue to manage to write, and they find ways to speak the truth. And outside, of course, I mean, in multiple languages, on multiple continents at this point.
Yeah.
There is a lot of Tibetan writing that is, right? I mean, it's not when we think of modern Tibetan writing and contemporary Tibetan, we use the word interchangeably. It's I think of modern Tibetan writing as something that's pre-post-colonial, where it's sort of waiting. And at some point, it will actually be post-colonial writing. It's not yet, but I think, Tibetans haven't lost. We're still holding on to the idea of having freedom, and then having at that point actual post-colonial Tibetan writing. So let's move on to. I think we can take a question from the crowd. Yes, sir?
I am from Mysore, India, and Bailkupe, the second largest settlement of exiled Tibetans, were settled there after Dharamshala. And I remember playing soccer with many Tibetan boys. They were quiet and reserved, but the sort of dispossession and nostalgia was sort of palpable. I'm curious about the Tibetans in Tibet. Do they still have a strong Tibetan identity, or is it getting diluted? Is it getting assimilated into the larger sort of Chinese culture?
I think it's very, very difficult to generalize about Tibetans because they're very, it's an incredibly diverse set of peoples. And I guess in I haven't been to Tibet in quite a few years. I think last time I was there was 2009. But I would feel very confident saying that, many Tibetans in Tibet, however you define that, have a very strong sense of Tibetan identity, and I think there's still very, very strong opposition to the sort of dominance of Han presence in Tibetan areas. And so that's not to say it's across the board. Of course, there's this a spectrum of ways that people have adapted, ways that people have assimilated, adapted their businesses, adapted their family lives, who they're friends with, who they marry. Of course, this is a very complex set of possibilities. But my sense is, in terms of the question, maybe the thrust of the question is that there's still plenty of Tibetan identity in Tibetan areas. What would you say?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I agree. I think change is inevitable. You know, I think that the ways in which we've changed in exile, I'm sure Tibetans in Tibet also, you know, change in many different ways. But I think how we view ourselves, how we name ourselves, I think that has remained the same. If you look at the literature from Tibet, if you look at sort of the songs, the films, right, all of that, right, indicate that that we still, you know, we are Tibetan, we're still here as Tibetan. And I think that that hasn't changed, and I don't think that, you know, even after all these years, the Chinese have not been able to win the hearts and minds of Tibetans, right? And I think that speaks a lot to their identity. What do you think?
I agree. I mean, you know, over like this 1,000-year period of Tibetan history, I mean, Tibetans always had Tibetan language, and that was their native language that they spoke and read and wrote. And now there is, with how hard the Chinese has been trying to sort of eliminate Tibetan and substitute Chinese, there is the danger, right, with children in schools, like mother tongue education is just being decimated. Yeah. So there is that danger of like mother tongue substitution and that sort of like Sinicization. But at the same time, I think Tibetans, the identity and sort of like Tibetan spirit is, yeah, we've seen that it's so strong. So the cultural identity, I think, remains really resilient and hopeful. One more question, and then yes. Right here. Oh, sure.
Oh, she's already got the mic.
We'll listen to you.
It's well known that at the time of the Chinese occupation of Tibet, the Dalai Lama himself had begun to introspect on the actual sociological conditions of the monks, the monasteries, and the proletariat. And as a result, when he was introspecting and thinking about changes that could and should be made, the invasion of China happened, and the opportunity for bringing sociological change in Tibet was lost. How much of the literature in exiled Tibetans and expatriate Tibetans actually critically thinks about that moment in history and evaluates the mistakes the Tibetans themselves made, which led to this evacuation and the diaspora moving out? I was just asking this question out of plain ignorance.
Who wants to take this question?
I'll say briefly that I think there's a lot of awareness of those dynamics in, you know, many different kind of Tibetan writers, whether from a literary perspective or historical perspective or sociological perspective. There's quite a lot of kind of maybe a sense of mourning that sort of, if we can call it a moment in history, of course, not just one moment that you can point at, but and also a critique of Buddhism, the place of Buddhist institutions, you know, in terms of cleaving to more traditional modes of power, for instance. And so from my perspective, I see a lot of self-reflection amongst Tibetan thinkers and authors, both at the time and as they've kind of, you know, progressed, not progressed towards some better future, but rather just developed, you know, historically, that there's a lot of awareness of those kind of sociological factors that you're pointing to. That's my impression.
Yeah, it's hard to answer your question because you know, I think there are two parts to it. One is that every society also adapts and changes at its own pace and time, right? And I think that that has to be one thing that we keep in mind. And the other that, you know, China's sort of the whole liberation kind of thing doesn't really, is not a valid answer at all, right? Or a solution to this point that you're trying to make. So it doesn't quite, I'm not answering your question, but I'm also sort of maybe posing that to some extent it's an unfair question. I think change would have come at some point, hopefully, but that's something we don't know at this point, right? I think Dalai Lama was making the changes. Yeah. But I do understand the intention of your question.
It's unfortunate that, Tibet didn't get the chance to change on our own, right? Like would have happened with other nations and other cultures. But I would suggest, actually, there's this book that is coming out, Echoes from Forgotten Mountains, Jamyang Norbu's Echoes from Forgotten Mountains, a Tibetan tale of war and peace. And that will answer your question, that book, which is like, this amazing writer's like magnum opus. It's the book has been writing over the last 50 years. Basically, it answers all of those questions, and it dissects what went wrong, what happened, but also it sort of puts, it tells like the scope of 20th century Tibetan history. It talks about why Tibet fell, but also it talks about the resistance movement that Tibetans across the plateau raised against the Chinese occupation. And basically, the mistake that Tibetans made was to be invaded before the Korean War instead of after the Korean War. Like really, if you look at 20th century geopolitics, that was our mistake. Which is a really unfortunate fact of history. If the invasion of Tibet had happened after the Korean War, the entire geopolitics calculus of Asia would have changed. And we would have this counterfactual of maybe Tibet would be a free nation today. It's just, read the book. It's wonderful. I urge all of you to read it. Echoes from Forgotten Mountains, Jamyang Norbu. Thank you so much for being a great audience.